going to start with, we're going to hear three bills today. The first one is HB 2805, and it concerns continuing certain exceptions for disclosure of public records under the Open Records Act. The second is this SB 285, which increases penalties for violation of protection orders, and also provides restitution for death or incapacity of a parent or guardian of a minor. And then the last of the three is HB 2300, which is to add clergy to the list of mandatory reporters for child sex abuse in Kansas. So the first bill is HB 2805, and I'd ask Natalie to review that for us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have finally made it to the most exciting bill hearing of the year. I know you guys anxiously anticipate this one. House Bill 2805 is the annual legislative review of exceptions to the disclosure of public records under the Kansas Open Records Act. As you all are very well aware, under the Kansas Open Records Act, any new or substantially amended exception to disclosure expires on July 1st, 5 years after enactment of that new provision, or if there were substantial amendments made to that exception, then that triggers a new review as well. And those expirations happen unless you guys all review those exceptions and continue them into existence. Before an exception expires, the reviser of statutes is required to certify to the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives the statutory language and citation of each of those exceptions that will expire in the upcoming year. And then under KSA 45229H, the legislature is directed to review each of those exceptions before its expiration and consider the following factors: what specific records are affected by the exception, whom does the exception uniquely affect as opposed to the general public, what is the identifiable public purpose or goal of the exception, and whether the information contained in the records may be obtained readily by alternative means, and how it may be obtained. Along with your packet on this bill, you have a document from our office that's entitled the 2019 New and Substantially Amended Kansas Open Records Exceptions. Those are the ones you guys will be reviewing today. In that packet, you can see the statutory text for all of those exceptions. So you can review those and look at those factors to determine whether you think they should all be continued into existence. I'll just give you a little kind of blurb about each one. One of them is in KSA 23906. It relates to the Department of Agriculture and the information obtained from fingerprinting and criminal history record checks under the Industrial Hemp Act. KSA 23907, that's the state fire marshal, related to the same type of information, criminal history information related to the Industrial Hemp Act. KSA 41511, that deals with reports of carriers of alcoholic liquors under the Alcoholic Beverage Control Act. KSA 56109A, this relates to the Scrap Metal Theft Reduction Act and the records in the database that's maintained by the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. And then finally, KSA 745227, that's the Secretary of Commerce information related that would be detrimental to the development of a STAR bond project or jeopardize an economic development incentive program. So those are the ones you're going to be reviewing, and I can take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Natalie, on the Department of Commerce, if we remove this exception, I guess it would be a question for now too, but there's the intent seems to be that there's things protected while the project's developing. But my question would be, these reports looking at retrospectively could possibly be useful, but they never come into the public light. Is that correct, how I read this?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Titus, yes. So those reports that are described in subsection E1 there, If this expiration provision goes away, the statute would just read that those reports are confidential and not subject to open records. You do always have the ability to extend that provision, instead of completely eliminating the expiration date, or you can take this time to make any changes to the language that you think would be necessary.
Are there any more questions? Representative?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Natalie, saying is that there's no other testimony on this bill. Can we go ahead and mark you down as a proponent?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Osmond, of course, we don't really testify on bills. It's funny that our office name is printed on this bill now that you guys print the requesters. So I'm here just to help you guys conduct your review. I would note there is one technical amendment that is attached with your packet. We got a little strike happy. And so on page 8, you'll see that we accidentally struck the provision, the actual exception language, providing that those records are not open to inspection. And so this would be a technical amendment to address that issue.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Natalie? Seeing none, thank you very much. We'll close the hearing. There being no proponents or opponents or neutrals on HB 2805. Moving on now to Senate Bill 265, which concerns increasing penalties for violation of protective orders and restitution under certain circumstances. Natalie, please give us a review of that one. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senate Bill 265 requires a person convicted of an offense that results in the incapacitation or death of a victim who is a parent or guardian of a minor child to pay restitution in the form of child support. And it also increases the criminal penalties for repeat violations of a protective order. New Section 1 adds a new section of law, and I would note that this was a floor amendment. It was added by the Senate Committee of the Whole. It provides that if a defendant is convicted of an offense that resulted in the incapacitation or death of a victim who is the parent or guardian of a minor child, then the court shall order the defendant to pay restitution in the form of reasonable and necessary support of each minor child of the victim until each minor child reaches the age of 18 and has graduated from high school, or the class of which the minor is a member when the child reaches 18, graduates from high school. When determining the amount of support that is reasonable and necessary, the bill lists factors for the court to consider, including the age of the child, the financial needs and resources of the child, the financial resources and needs of the surviving parent or guardian, or the resources of the state if the child is in state custody, the standard of living to which the child is accustomed, the physical and emotional condition of the child and the child's educational needs, the child's legal custody and residency, and the reasonable child care expenses of the surviving parent. The court shall order the support payments be paid to the child's parent or guardian, and that order can be enforced the judgment of restitution under KSA 2169 and 216604. If the victim or the victim's family brings a civil action against the defendant prior to the court ordering, making this restitution order, and a judgment is obtained in that proceeding, then the restitution described in this section shall not be ordered. And if the court enters a restitution order under this section, and the victim or victim's family subsequently brings a civil action against the defendant and obtains a judgment, then the restitution order issued pursuant to this section is required to be offset by the amount of that judgment in that civil action. Section 2 amends KSA 2159-24. That's the statute in the Kansas Criminal Code that defines a crime of violation of a protective order. Current law there provides that the crime is a Class A person misdemeanor generally, and then it's a severity level 6 person felony when the protective order violated is an extended protective order described in the Protection from Abuse Act or the Protection from Stalking, Sexual Assault, or Human Trafficking Act. This bill increases the general penalty to a severity level 7 person felony upon a second or subsequent conviction, and then up to a severity level 4 person felony upon a second or subsequent conviction for an extended protective order. And I can take any questions.
Thank you, Natalie. Are there any questions for Natalie? Representative Heiberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In your opinion, does the bill as amended by the Senate comply with the single subject rule? Seems like it's pushing the limits a little bit.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Heiberger, the new section relates to restitution orders, which are generally orders that are granted resulting from some type of criminal conduct. And you'll see that the single subject here is concerning crimes, punishment, and criminal procedure. So that's the argument being made here, I suppose, as to why it would be a single subject, but that's certainly up to you guys to decide whether you think it comports with that rule.
Well, they do seem to both be crimes.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions for Natalie? Seeing none, we'll move on to proponent testimony. The first is on WebEx. The Honorable Philip Journey of the 18th Judicial District. Judge, are you there?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
I can, and thank you for coming and talking with us about this important subject.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to come before the committee, Mr. Chairman, to talk about this legislation. I've had it filed, I don't know, 4 or 5 years now, and I'm glad it's finally getting some legs. Right now, I serve in the Family Law Department in Sedgwick County District Court. I have the equivalent of about 100,000 people's divorces, paternity cases, protection from abuse. I do those temporary orders every 5th week. Generally, I do about 100 of them. Sedgwick County is like the center of the storm. When you look at the statistics and the KBI reports from the last couple of years, it's pretty clear that Sedgwick County is a significantly higher incident rate than the rest of the state. And in my term as a judge in the family law, I've been there for 7 years. I think I did another 2 years before that. The reality is that when I see the victims and the difficulties that are placed upon them by the bad actors, it is difficult to tell them, he's going to just go to the jail for a little while. He'll be out soon. He'll be back to see you. And the reality is, if they violate these orders a number of times, they should be sanctioned far more higher than they are now. Misdemeanor, generally 12 months, $2,500 fine maximum. Judges don't impose the maximum. They want to try to give them probation. They don't have enough room at the end. And for example, some of the examples that I had in my testimony, if you would review that, included one from Johnson County and another one from Sedgwick County, and they both have been convicted of violating the restraining orders. In fact, one of them actually had the restraining order in her pocket when she was killed by the assailant. Sedgwick County and Kansas need to come into the 21st century when it comes to dealing with domestic violence. And when we have people that repeatedly violate the law, the truth is that the restraining orders aren't made out of Kevlar, and they need to have some safety, both physically in reality and in their own minds too. And so when someone repeatedly violates these orders, they should be handed a stiffer sentence each time, and that's what we try to do. To get to the severity level 4, they have to have a final order entered against them in a PFA or a PFS. And then while that order is in place, they have to violate that order. And then the plaintiff can come back and ask for the order to be extended a year, or in some instances to the lifetime of the plaintiff and the defendant. And that doesn't stop them. And if they continue to harass and torment their families, then I think that severity level 4 is an appropriate one to get them out of circulation and give these people some peace of mind. I know it's a little more complicated than that. I'd ask you to review the testimony that I provided, and I'm certainly more than willing to answer any questions from the committee.
Thank you, Your Honor. Are there any questions? Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Judge Journey, I do agree with you and appreciate you bringing us this legislation. It's, in my estimation, long overdue. But there is an aspect to your testimony that concerns me, specifically the second paragraph of your written testimony. Are you the same Philip Journey that was once a member of the Kansas Senate?
Yes, I know, hard to believe. Golly, they'll just let anybody through the door, won't they?
And you did acquire some wisdom in the Senate, limited as it might be, but you, I believe, served on the Senate Judiciary Committee.
Yes,
Was
for
that
4 years, yes.
were you in leadership on the committee? I cannot recall. It was before
No,
my time.
I did not get to be vice chair or chair. I served at the time of John Rattle.
That becomes somewhat self-explanatory. I won't explain it to the younger members of the committee today. But Journey, in the second paragraph of your testimony, you urge us to strip the amendment that the Senate Judiciary Committee placed on your fine legislation. It sounds like a betrayal of your old colleagues to me, but I
Well,
assume there's a reason.
it was a floor vote. It was a floor vote that put it on. The committee of the whole did it, not the Judiciary Committee. And I've always liked David Haley, and he has this idea. He couldn't get a hearing on his bill, and he put it on a caboose on this one. I mean, really, I mean, how realistic is that? I mean, homicide, pay for the kids' child support. The last time I checked, if they didn't get a job inside KDOC, they got like 15 cents a day. I mean, it's hardly worth doing the paperwork if they're going to be a long-term inmate. I mean, it's a worthy goal. Also, lawyers tend to practice in one area of the law or the other, and I'll tell you, the ones that are in criminal aren't doing family law for a reason because they don't want to, and I think it crosses the lines between the disciplines, and it would put a lot of people in a difficult place. It also has significantly different factors to consider than what we do normally under child support with the child support guidelines and the Supreme Court rules that involve that. I think it's an additional burden that's placed on the criminal courts that are already overburdened. And I just don't see that there would be a significant amount of subsistence from people that are incarcerated for extended periods of time to be able to go to their victims' kids.
Senator Journey, your words make a great deal of sense to this representative. And this was, you say, David Haley's floor amendment?
Yes.
Well, that explains a lot about it, Senator, and I appreciate you enlightening us. There were other questions, Mr. Vice Chair, that I wanted to ask him about his remarks on Kansas Week 3 weeks ago when he was clearly in error. But I will save those questions for another occasion.
Hey,
Thank you,
let's go
Judge.
eat lunch and we'll talk about it.
It's always good to see you, my friend. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any further questions for the judge? If not, we'll move on. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. I think I'll stay around. This is fun.
Good.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
The next proponent to speak is Michelle McCormick, Executive Director of Kansas Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. Welcome to committee.
Good afternoon, members of the committee, Chairman. I am Michelle McCormick. I'm the Executive Director of the Kansas Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. Good to see you all again. I don't know if I'm going to be as entertaining as Judge Journey, but I'll do my best. I am here in support of the bill, the part of the bill that's addressing protection orders, which I feel is more in my scope of practice. And just, you have my written testimony, but I want to just summarize that, in general, we're in support of the enhancement for the protection orders. The civil protection order can be an important tool for victims and survivors if the abusive party is someone who has a high stake in conformity. And so when they get served with the protective order, they say, wow, this is a significant situation, and so I'm going to restrain myself. Unfortunately, we see situations all the time where the person causing harm actually has a very low stake in conformity, and then the protective order is just really a piece of paper. And so it becomes a powerful tool, when the crime was created a violation of a protection order, and then that allows a victim or survivor to call for law enforcement support in order to try to get assistance with their safety. And so we're, I want to make the connection in particular that we believe that a second violation of a protection order is really a significant red flag for us about being connected to, it should indicate the potential for extreme danger. And I would consider that what we call a lethality factor. It could be a risk factor indicating the perpetrator has escalated to the point where they're putting their significant other at extreme risk. And so that, in general terms, is why we're in support of this. You will see in my written testimony that we have asked for an amendment to this bill because one of the things that's come to my attention is that the protection order process in Kansas is not statutorily clear that it's a no fee process. And so certainly we don't want any victims or survivors to be deterred from using the tool because they're concerned about paying a process serving fee. It's my understanding that our current statutes indicate that there are no court docket fees assessed, but it doesn't clarify that there's not a fee for sheriff's offices to serve the orders. I will say that, I've been a victims advocate for a very long time, and sheriff's offices in general have a lot of compassion for victims and survivors and aren't charging those fees regularly, but it does happen occasionally. I also have come to understand that under the Federal Violence Against Women Act, charging fees is prohibited. And in order to qualify for the funding that comes along with that, which currently Kansas receives a little over $1.8 million in what are called STOP funds or Stop Violence Against Women funds. And those fees could be put in jeopardy if we don't clarify the statute that it should be a no fee process. And so in my written testimony, you could see that we pointed out, we made some suggested amendments to several statutes that address that. And so just put that forward for your consideration. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Committee, are there any questions? Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I failed to ask his honor whether he would agree to this, but I'm going to ask you. If someone were to offer an amendment that stripped out the portion about the child support for victims, you would still be in support of the bill, wouldn't you?
I would be.
And also, I intend to ask the next proponent whether or not they're in agreement on the no fees. But if we weren't able to get that put in there, you would still be in support of the bill.
I would be.
All right. Thank you.
Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, or Mr. Vice Chair. I appreciate you being here. I agree with what you said. I am a little concerned, though. Did the Senate get an opportunity to add the no fees for service amendment? Was that presented to them, rejected, or is that something that we're the first to hear, to your knowledge?
As far as I know, you're the first to hear that. Yeah.
I certainly hope we can accommodate you, budgets being what they may. Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So along the same lines of this bill, I know a few years ago we passed legislation that would require notification when a lot of times there's a protection order and then that person is taken for jail for a certain period of time. But now I think the law would require that the aggrieved person, the person that has been victimized, would be notified that that person has been released from jail. Has that had an impact, and does that kind of play along the same lines as this?
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Representative. I mean, I think that's had a positive impact. I know that anecdotally, I don't have hard data on that. I think that I would recommend you could connect with the Victim Services Division of the Attorney General's office, who coordinates the victim notification program, and they could probably give you some information about increased use of that system. I know anecdotally, I think I've heard our member programs and their victim advocates talk about feeling like that was an improvement, and it could give the opportunity for victims, of course, to make safety plans if they get those notifications. And I believe that that's happening pretty regularly. So I think that folks generally are satisfied with that change. Mm-hmm.
Any further member? I have a question. Having worked in this area for how long? With victim.
I started out as an overnight shelter advocate in 1998. So 25 years.
So my question is, are you familiar with protection laws in other states? And if so, can you enlighten us as to how Kansas compares in that regard?
Somewhat. I do have the opportunity. We are the Department of Health and Human Services designated coalition for the state of Kansas, and each state has a counterpart coalition. They have coalitions, or sometimes they have separate domestic violence, sexual violence coalitions. And we're networked, and so I get to engage with those folks pretty regularly. I would say that our protection order laws are quite similar, although I do think that most of the other states have a no-fee process that's written into their law so that they can be eligible for the federal funding. Apart from that, I'm not aware of significant departures between our laws and other states, but would be happy to look into that further if you are interested.
If you have anything that's readily available to you, you might please send it to the Fran, and she'll distribute it to the rest of the committee.
Sounds great. Absolutely.
Any further questions? If not, we'll move on to the next. Thank you very much. To the next proponent, which is Ed Klump, a regular at this committee, and he represents law enforcement, various associations.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Committee members, appreciate that. I am Ed Klump, and I am here representing the testimonies on behalf of the Kansas Association of Chiefs of Police, Kansas Sheriff's Association, Kansas Peace Officers Association. I want to make it clear right off the bat, I'm here on Section 2 of the bill, not on Section 1. That doesn't have anything to do with law enforcement procedures or functions. This bill in Section 2 addressing the repeat offenders of protection order violations is very important to us. You heard from Judge Journey the perspectives of what he sees in the courtroom. I can tell you that as far back as when I was still an active police officer, I got to see the horror on the faces of victims as we dealt with people that were violating these protection orders. Sometimes they were still there. Sometimes it was even after they were gone. The fact is, like Michelle said, that when a person violates these protection orders repeatedly, it is a huge red flag. First time you can say, okay, this was a learning experience. Keep in mind also that the second offense isn't going to happen until the first conviction has already occurred, probably prior to the second offense that raises the sentencing. So, you have somebody that goes Friday night and violates protection order, and you charge them, and then they go Wednesday night of the next week and violate it. They're probably still not going to get the second charge because they don't have a conviction on the record when they committed the second one. But it's those kind of activities that really raise the hair on the back of our necks, because we have seen so many times when these people that repeatedly violate these protection orders, it advances into extreme violence, homicides, and just the simple terror that it puts into these victims that have provided the court with enough information to have one of these protection orders issued. You just see it, that it is affecting every day, every minute of their life. And so we think this is very important. We think these multiple violations are very, very substantial and deserve the added sentencing provisions being proposed in this bill. And we would suggest that you move that part of the bill forward. I do want to address Michelle's recommendation for the amendment. Michelle came to us some months ago and talked to us about that, I think even before the session started. And so we talked to our association. We have no problem with that at all. We actually think there's other statutes that kind of tell us we shouldn't be charging those, but Michelle's right, none is clear. And so we would like to have that clarity. So we fully support the amendment that they proposed. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I think I'll just stand for questions.
Are there any questions for Mr. Klump? Seeing none, thank you very much, sir. The next proponent is written only, and we have no opponents or neutrals. So there are no more questions for any of the conferees from the committee. We will close the hearing on Senate Bill 265 and move on to a hearing on House Bill 2300, which is a bill that would add clergy to the list of mandatory reporters of child sexual abuse in the state of Kansas. We have, I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 in-person proponents, and we will start, if she's here, and she may not be, Senator Holscher. I believe she has things going on in the Senate and asked, excuse me. Yes, sorry. I jumped the gun on this. We do need Natalie to explain the bill. Then we'll move on to proponents.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Need is a strong word, but I'm happy to do it. I know you all read them before I get up here, but House Bill 2300 requires a duly ordained minister of religion to report certain abuse and neglect of children, except when that reporting would violate the penitential communication privilege. The bill amends KSA 382223. That's the statute that requires certain people to report certain abuse and neglect of children. Current law requires reporting when a person has a reason to suspect that a child has been harmed as a result of physical, mental, or emotional abuse or neglect or sexual abuse, when that person is a certain type of healthcare provider, certain providers of mental health services, a teacher or other employee of an educational institution, licensed childcare provider or employee, a firefighter, EMS, law enforcement officer, juvenile intake and assessment worker, court services officer, community corrections officer, case manager or mediator, or an employee or volunteer of an organization that provides social services to pregnant teenagers. This bill would add that duly ordained ministers of religion, as defined in KSA 6429, would have to make those reports of suspected harm, neglect, or sexual abuse. However, a duly ordained minister of religion would not have to make that report if the minister suspects abuse or neglect based on a penitential communication, and that report would violate the penitential communication privilege as defined in KSA 6429. And I can take any questions.
Any questions for Natalie? Seeing none, we'll move on now to the proponents. Senator Holscher is listed as the first proponent, but she, I think, has some work in the Senate at the moment, and so we'll skip her and hope that she returns before we finish. So we'll now hear from Amber Delcamp, a citizen who is, I believe, on WebEx. Amber, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Hi to everybody at the House Judiciary Committee. I'm testifying today to show my support for legislation that would reform clergy to become mandated reporters of abuse here in the state of Kansas. I feel that Kansas kids deserve another layer of protection by doing this, and I know that this is important as I attended Catholic school myself, and I also sent my children to Catholic schools here in Kansas. And I was quite surprised upon initially learning that no law like this has ever existed in Kansas, and I strongly feel that there needs to be one. A priest is much like a counselor, and counselors are already mandated reporters here in our state, so making this important change for Kansas moving forward seems like a smart move for the greater good. Clergy are integral parts of communities throughout Kansas, and by passing House Bill 2300, clergy would be greatly elevating the overall safety of communities across Kansas by becoming mandated reporters of abuse. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber. Are there any questions for Amber? Seeing none, thank you so much for giving us your views. We'll move on. I see that Senator Holscher just joined us. If she would like, she can come on up and give her testimony. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Please let us know what you're thinking.
Great. Honorable members of the House Judiciary Committee, thank you for having me today. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on this very critical issue of mandatory reporting requirements for clergy members. You have my testimony, and I won't read through that, but I will just hit a couple highlights. As a longtime advocate for survivors of sexual abuse, I stand before you today in support of HB 2300, which would compel clergy members to report instances of suspected child abuse or neglect. This is a matter of utmost importance as it directly impacts the safety and well-being of our most vulnerable citizens. Some very important points to consider. Clergy can be a very important voice for children being abused and or neglected. Often children do not feel comfortable disclosing information, particularly to authorities, mainly because they do not know how to do so or where to even go. If you suspect as a clergy person any type of child abuse or neglect, you are helping the welfare of that child by making a report. As a mandated reporter, clergy are not the investigator, so it takes off the pressure. The focus of actions and conversations are to establish and reinforce a level of trust and comfort for the child, something that is very comfortable and very natural often as a clergy member has a relationship often with family and children. Finally, including clergy as part of mandatory reporting laws would have them join the ranks of other professionals like teachers, medical personnel, counselors, and firefighters, while reinforcing the societal expectation that everyone has a responsibility to protect children from harm. I ask for your support on HB 2300. Thank you for allowing me to provide testimony, and I will stand for questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Senator, we're going to have questions right now if there are any for you. Any member of the committee have questions? Seeing none, we will move on to the next proponent, which is Catherine Mosher from the Family Service and Guidance Center. Welcome to committee, Catherine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee members, thank you for my opportunity to testify today. My name is Kathy Mosher, and I am a licensed clinical psychotherapist and CEO of Family Service and Guidance Center here in Topeka. We have specialized in the mental health treatment of youth and families for over 50 years. My understanding of this bill is that it protects youth by adding clergymen to the list of mandated reporters of abuse. And as a born and raised Catholic, it appears that this bill still protects the sanctity and confidentiality of what is said in the confessional process. Often allegations are reported to clergymen by a concerned person or by a child seeking help from a trusted adult outside of confession, much like what happens with teachers. So clergymen, like mental health professionals, doctors, and are revered as safe and trusted adults. And that's what we teach them, is to find a trusted adult and tell them. So it makes sense that clergymen would have the responsibility to be held to the same high professional standard as any other mandated reporter. So I support House Bill 2300 and thank you for your consideration of this important legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mosher. Are there any questions for Ms. Mosher? Seeing none, we will go on to the next proponent, which is Reverend Dr. Paxton Jones, who's a citizen. Welcome to the committee, Reverend.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been my privilege to serve as an ordained minister within the Christian Church Disciples of Christ for more than 40 years. 23 in congregational ministry, 18 on our regional staff, including the last 10 as a regional minister, which in our denomination is the equivalency of a bishop. Prior to my retirement, for more than a dozen of those years, I was a volunteer chaplain with the police departments both in Salina, Kansas, and here in town. The scriptures are clear that we are to protect the most vulnerable among us, especially children. We who are clergy are charged by the very nature of our calling to fulfill this obligation. I first moved to Kansas in 1977, and I was astonished to learn that clergy were not mandatory reporters. As a local pastor, I have been fortunate never to have to report one of my parishioners because those suspicions did not arise, but I assure you that had they arisen, I would have reported that. I also made it clear to my parishioners that that would be the case. Later, as a regional minister, I counseled the clergy under me to adopt that same position. The why is quite simple. One day I walked into a room where there was a husband, wife, and an 8-year-old daughter. The marks on the woman's face and neck were still red from where he had hit her. There were various colored bruises underneath those red marks. Their 8-year-old daughter was sitting between them, protecting her mother. The man's defense, and I refuse to call him a father, the man's defense, and I quote, was the Bible says the man is head of the household, so if I tell her to get me another beer and she refuses, I have the right to hit her. My admonitions that the Bible says much more about love and grace, compassion, forgiveness, and understanding fell on deaf ears, at least his deaf ears. He kept coming back to his same biblical justification. The physical abuse endured by that woman was self-evident. Less evident, although I still knew it was there, was the emotional abuse on that young girl. How could anyone, but especially how could any member of the clergy, turn away and not report that? To have done so would have said to the woman and to the little girl, not only that they were unimportant, but that this was to be expected and was normative, and they should just shut up and endure it. As a pastor, as a Christian, as a father, it was my duty to report that abuse. The church of all places in society should be the preeminent place of safety for those who are seeking it, especially from their abusers. It cannot be if we as clergy are allowed to escape reporting suspected abuse. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend. Are there any questions? Yes, Representative Goddard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Reverend, for being here today and presenting your testimony. You as an individual have said that you would report that kind of abuse or abuse of any kind.
Yes, sir.
As long as you didn't violate your penitential privilege.
Correct.
Are there many ministers and priests that you're acquainted with would do the same thing, or are there people who would not report that abuse?
It's a difficult question to answer. The clergy with whom I am familiar, with very few exceptions, would report it. There probably are some who would not. Within our denomination, regional ministers have the unlimited power of suggestion. We cannot order a pastor to report the abuse, but we certainly request that they do.
Give them all the encouragement that you can.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Representative Curtis, please.
I think
We just hold off there.
To that question, Representative, there is some research that suggests that when mandated reporting becomes, when clergy are added to mandated reporting, that what happens is that it removes the moral obligation. What it does is it says that the moral obligation to report becomes equal to I guess the restraints of the church, I guess is what I'm trying to say. That then the law becomes equal, the law of the land, and becoming a mandate reporter becomes equal to the confines of the church. Does that make sense?
I believe it does.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my question is for Reverend Jones. So I don't think that this bill necessarily calls for any kind of training. Do you think having training on reporting would be something that would be essential for the clergy if they're added as mandatory reporters?
Are you asking in terms of the how-to report?
Yes, so that we don't have a case of like over-reporting. I know, like in my area, a lot of times things are reported when it's really directed towards people living in poverty versus abuse. So I'm just wondering what kind of training you think would be necessary for the clergy to become good mandatory reporters.
Within our seminaries, courses in pastoral care are mandatory in order to be ordained. It would be helpful to have a component on how to recognize abuse, how to report it, how to support the victims. Most clergy are going to try to support the abuser too. And I can tell you firsthand, that's a difficult road to hoe because you know they're in the wrong. Yet they also need spiritual guidance. So yes, in answer to your question, training would be helpful. I'm not in a position to tell you what kind of training that will be.
Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To tag on to what you said, if this were to become law, I would highly suggest that there become some formalized training. And I say that because there are mandated reporters today who don't completely understand their obligation. And certainly that to get everybody on the exact same page with what that means.
Sure.
We often find ourselves going into the schools and other public entities to remind them of what those responsibilities are. So certainly, if we make this into law, we'll need advocates out there that push for that type of formal training, and I mean formal.
Sure. Within my denomination, we are required to do continuing education, and I would certainly talk to my successors about making that a mandatory part of our standing.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Not truly a question. I know you will get to this in due course, but I do believe that Ms. McCormick in her neutral testimony, although she's not intending to testify, addresses this very issue. I think she's here today, and you may want to give some consideration if she wants to elaborate, because I think it's a serious question that's being raised here, and we need to find a good way to remedy it.
Thank you for that suggestion. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
The next proponent is Michael Sandridge.
Hello, my name is Michael Sandridge, and I'd like to express my views for the bill. I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. My abuse was by a Catholic priest. The bill would make it mandatory for religious clergy to report abuse. I spent several weeks sitting at the table at the state capitol printing this bill with Joe. While speaking to many people who came by, most were astonished that the clergy were exempt from this kind of reporting. The question that was asked many times, even by non-Catholics, was the sanctity of the seal of confession. And this bill specifically leaves that privileged communication out. So to put it simply, and after following these very eloquent speakers, the bill would just help restore trust in the faith community, just allow another tool for law enforcement and the court system, and quite simply make the clergy accountable for the safety of children, more so. The Catholic diocese, I've spoken to many people, support this. In fact, Mr. Chuck Weber was supposed to speak for it, but I don't see him here today. And quite simply, the bill reinforces the moral responsibility, but the legal responsibility as well. And it's just plainly the right thing to do. And as an aside, real quickly, and spending time with Joe and just watching people walk by, it's amazing to me that we really don't know as citizens how the government works. And you're all so kind and accessible that it was quite shocking, because you imagine that, you're behind walls and guards. You were just there and listening, whether you agreed or disagreed. And it was amazing how many people came through with different opinions and that could be heard. And I just want to thank you for that experience.
Thank you, sir. Are there any questions for Mr. Sandridge? Okay. No, thank you for your testimony, sir. The next proponent, oh, by the way, you did mention Chuck Weber, and he has put in written proponent testimony. He's not here in person, though. The next proponent here is Joe Cherry.
Well,
welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Representative Lewis. And when I started this back in November, I had no idea that this was going to get this far. So I really appreciate the time that everybody has taken to be on this committee and for giving this hearing. My name is Joe Sherray. I am a sexual abuse survivor. My abuser was my grandfather, who was the president of the Altar Guild of our church, a major financial contributor, usher, and during the summertime helped put together the church picnic. He always made sure he had a relationship with whatever priest who was in residence in our church. The church I grew up in was Sacred Heart Parish in Baileyville, Kansas. My abuse started at the age of 10 and ended at the age of 15. The sexual abuse consisted of fondling, vaginal penetration, oral sex, and at one time attempted sexual intercourse. He would even molest me in the pew during service. I would have to sit next to him in the pew during service. He would fold his arms, and with a hand under his elbow, he would fondle the side of my breasts when we were seated. At the age of 15, I had had enough, and it was time to get out. Things blew up in a severely dangerous way one Sunday afternoon while I was hanging clothes up on the line outside. He got angry after I told everyone in the house I didn't want anyone in my room anymore after finding things of mine in my brother's room. He ransacked my room. My curtains were torn off the wall, bed upended, dresser drawers emptied, and the closet torn up. After I finished hanging up clothes that day, I had to go in and clean my room. He also called me a whore, bitch, and slut. Later that day, I took matters into my own hands and escaped to Seneca and demanded my high school counselor do her job as a mandated reporter. I threatened to kill myself, go out in a body bag, or kill her and her husband and go to juvenile detention. Extreme conditions called for extreme actions that day. I tried going to our priest a few times during that time and nothing happened. Why should it? He wasn't a mandated reporter of abuse in the state of Kansas at the time. Had I known this, I wouldn't have gone to him, but I didn't know this. Had I known this, I would have gone to DCF. Later, after I got out and I was in a foster home, I called him and he said I should go home and pray that things get better. Kansas is one of 10 states and territories in the United States. The clergy are not listed as mandated reporters of abuse. Neighboring states around us all have some statute for clergy with respect to mandatory reporting. The DCF website lists 13 professions that are mandated to report abuse. Clergy are absent from that list. It's too late for me to be able to benefit from the help this legislation would have afforded me at the time of my abuse, but it's not too late for others going forward. I urge everyone on this committee to please pass this favorably out of committee. Help current and future victims of abuse have one more safety net in place to help them escape their abuse. Thank you for listening, and I will stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Joe. And I can just say that your persistence has paid off, so thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any members who have questions for Joe? I have one more question. When you talked to your counselor, I believe, and to the priest, did you actually tell him of the sexual abuse?
Yes, I did. I went in very much in detail with them as to what was going on. And they didn't want to go up against my grandfather. Again, he was a prominent member of the community. He not only gave to the church, but he also gave to the school and was a big booster of all the activities. There was literally no safe place for me in Baileyville, Kansas.
Thank you. Seeing no questions, I do think Representative Carmichael's suggestion is a good one. If Ms. McCormick would like to speak to I believe it's the training issue, we'd be happy to hear.
Thank you. Michelle McCormick, Executive Director of the Kansas Coalition. And yeah, we submitted neutral testimony, not because we aren't in support of the intent behind this bill, because I think certainly you've heard the compelling information about why this could be really impactful. But I'm a licensed social worker, which makes me a mandated reporter in our state. And so my concern was mostly about could there be additions to a bill that would spell out training requirements or maybe specifications around what that curriculum of that training could entail? I got that training through my social work education. I complete continuing education requirements for to maintain my license as a social worker. There are state regulations by the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board that govern what unprofessional conduct looks like in my role, including not attaining training. And so my concern was I'm not sure how the clergy's training is managed in our state. And so, and I've seen, mandated reporting go awry as well. In particular, there's a great deal of research that shows people over-report neglectful conditions, which overburdens our system and then takes away really important resources to address the cases like we've heard about today. And often that comes from folks not having maybe a values conflict or a bias against not, having maybe experience with folks who are of a lower socioeconomic status or a difference. And they see that as, they mistake that as abuse. And so I think getting regular training on these topics could hopefully prevent some of the over-reporting that we've seen happen in those areas and reserve the much needed resources for cases like the childhood sexual abuse cases you've heard described today.
I have a question. You mentioned over-reporting. Do you also find that there's some under-reporting? In other words, that mandatory reporters don't see the signs. In good faith, they just don't see the signs of sexual abuse.
Oh, certainly. I think that, I would just, I think Representative Smith, I think you said that, there are folks who maybe don't have clarity who are mandated reporters already. And I think that certainly can be the case. And I know that when it comes to issues of like sexual violence, for sure, in my career, we've seen folks, we've come a long way from where folks really regarded these things as private matters or issues that stayed within a family. But because of some of the roots of that, we still see there be misunderstanding about the issues, a lack of recognition of the dynamics, a lack of recognitions of the signs. I'll use myself as an example. I told you I've been an advocate, victims advocate for a long time. But it wasn't until like 2010 when I first started getting training on the issue of human trafficking and what that looked like. I'd been working at a shelter program for many years and didn't realize that what I had been seeing while I was working there was in fact human trafficking by our state laws now. And then since that time, got training on it, now recognize those signs better. And so, and that's all I'm suggesting is that I think these folks could also benefit from additional training on those dynamics.
Thank you. Are there any yes, Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Thank you for your indulgence in allowing us to hear from her personally. Part of the reason that I invited you, I guess, to step up here is I don't know how many thousand clergy people there are in Kansas. And I don't know what kind of resources there are out there to train several thousand people. Now, the Behavioral Sciences Board can adopt rules and regulations and can require their licensees to have certain forms of continuing education and presumably knows how to structure it, how to gather the resources. So not only is there a requirement for education, but there are available resources to do it. I'm looking for your professional advice, not in the counselor person relationship, but rather your experience. How could we I don't know how to statutorily write a law that would accomplish the worthy goal that you set for us. Do you have any suggestions? Because the, the state doesn't license ministers. We can't promulgate rules and regulations probably telling a congregation or a church or a synagogue what to do. So how do we get from where we are to where we need to be, understanding that most of us in this room aren't experts?
Thank you, Representative Carmichael. I think that it's a really good point. And I was I was considering sort of the existing resources that I'm aware of. For example, I know there are nonprofit organizations that offer this kind of training for free. The Children's Alliance, Kansas Children's Service League. Of course, they are focusing on providing that to helping professionals. But last I checked, there were between 5,000 and 6,000 social workers in the state of Kansas, and so they've managed to navigate a large volume of training. And so I'd be curious is there an opportunity to build in perhaps as an incremental step a voluntary process to attain training or a number of training hours. And then I don't know if folks are able to collect data on that, and then we can make a data-driven decision about what might need to be next.
Just as an observation, Mr. Vice Chair, I think probably an incremental approach is going to be best because you have people, hundreds, if not thousands of people all over the state that would require mandated training. And I'm not sure the resources are there. And if they were, it might take away from other people who need the training too. So I'm not sure how we get there. I think it's a laudable goal, but my presumption is you'd rather have the bill as is than no bill at all.
Yeah, I believe so. Okay. I also would just offer to Representative Lewis's point during the last bill testimony, perhaps we could look at other states who have already navigated this territory and see how they've set it up. Do some research.
Thank you. Representative Osmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I read your testimony, and I do agree. I agree that this is something that is important and we should be looking at. My concern, I think, along with echoing Representative Carmichael, but my concern is that with all the bill as it's written adds subsection G to subsections A through F. So puts clergy on equal playing field with everybody else that's a mandated reporter. But the bill itself or the law itself doesn't mandate what the training requirements are or anything like that. So it's a laudable goal, and I'm interested to see if we can actually accomplish it. But to insert it into the bill would require it for everybody up and down the line. And the question then becomes, is that more training than they currently have? Is that less training than they currently have? And now we're statutorily mandating them to do less training than their associations might already do. So I would love to be able to figure it out, but let's see what we can do.
Thank you. Representative Smith.
Yeah, I just want to point out that the mandated reporting portal on DCF actually has an access to training for individuals for adult protective services, child protective services, etc. You could add a specific line for clergy because they are somewhat unique given their penitential privilege. So there would be definitely questions if I were clergy, even if I didn't have the formal training, which I would encourage them to do, not mandate them to do, but encourage them to do. Even if you didn't have that, if you knew that you could go online and ask the question or have a FAQ, that would probably help them in that. That's, I think, the essential thing that we would need for training, in my opinion, for mandated reporting for clergy. But training is not a new wheel we need to invent. It's there.
Thank you, Representative Curtis. Did you have a question?
I will. Yes, definitely. And thank you for being here, Michelle. I'm glad you were able to get up and testify. It's real helpful. The other question in our discussion that comes to mind is that I know we have a lot of non-denominational, so I'm trying to figure out who is clergy, because in my community, we have a lot of churches that are they're non-denominational, but they've kind of just sprung up with the community, and sometimes they meet in a building, and sometimes, so I'm trying to like, so then all of a sudden it comes to my mind, like, who is clergy? So I'm not sure so with that, do you think that this would extend to anybody who, I guess, perhaps calls themselves a clergy person and is preaching to a congregation, or is that?
If I might, we do have a definition, and Natalie can give it to us, and then the conferee can jump in.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, so the bill cross-references the definition in KSA 6429, which is, I mean, it's a little long, but I will read it to you here. So a duly ordained minister of religion means a person who has been ordained in accordance with the ceremonial, ritual, or discipline of a church, religious sect, or organization established on the basis of a community of faith and belief, doctrines and practices of a religious character, to preach and to teach the doctrines of such church, sect, or organization, and to administer the rites and ceremonies thereof in public worship, and who has his or her regular and customary vocation, preaches and teaches the principles of religion, and administers the ordinance of public worship as embodied in the creed or principles of such church, sect, or organization. The term regular minister of religion, which is used in that definition, means one who, as his or her customary vocation, preaches and teaches the principles of religion of a church, a religious sect, or organization of which he or she is a member, without having been formally ordained as a minister of religion, and who is recognized by such church, sect, or organization as a regular minister. And then it goes on to provide some examples of what is not included in that, if you want to read those.
Yeah, that pretty much narrows it down. Thank you.
I was just going to offer, and I concur. Yeah.
Are there any further questions for Ms. McCormick? Yes, Representative Schreiber.
Not necessarily a question, but just a comment, just doing quick online search. Other states have online training set up that clearly identifies clergy, social workers, et cetera, types of training and FAQs about what it is and what it isn't, when they should report and that sort of thing. So I think there are resources out there that we can model pretty effectively. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions from the members, and so we thank you for your help with this. There's a written only testimony in support by Representative Dr. Kirk Haskins, Laurel Birchfield, Reverend Isabel Call, Reverend Charles McKenzie, Reverend Jacob Poindexter, and Chuck Weber from the Kansas Catholic Conference. Opponent, written only, from the Reverend Susan Candia from the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, and neutral from Ms. McCormick, and we've heard from her on that in that regard. Understandably, she supports the bill, but wants training added, and also from neutral from Reverend, written only, from Reverend Justin Panzer from the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and Reverend Dr. John Bruss from the St. John's Lutheran Church. I believe we're at the end of our hearing on House Bill 2300, and if there's nothing more, we will close the hearing and the Judiciary Committee meeting for the day. Thank you all for coming. Let me see if I can pull out my cheat sheet.